is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from a clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me as always is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. I once saw him cast lower water when his sink got clogged, Stu Horvath.
What? Where did that come from?
Stu, we're weekly now. I'm reaching here.
Ooh, yeah.
That actually came from page 48 of the original Players Handbook.
I wish I could cast that spell. My plumber seems to be over my house an awful lot.
And they charge a lot, too.
Every visit is a minimum charge of like a lot. Contribute to our Patreon, folks.
Please and thank you. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. So, Stu, how you doing today?
Pretty good.
And what are we talking about today?
The iconic first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Players Handbook.
Also known as the place where we got the idea for our vintage RPG artwork.
It's true, because it's so iconic.
Thanks again, Schaefer Brown.
So, yeah, I mean, you can't start anywhere other than the cover. It's just, look at it. It's so good.
It is so good, and unlike the cover of the Monster Manual, which is a previous episode that we did, it's very different in style than the Monster Manual and a lot more in line with the Dungeon Master's Guide.
Totally. Trampier's got the cover duties, so it's, a contrast to Sutherland from the Monster Manual. I think that more than any other piece of early Dungeons & Dragons artwork, this one is the one that kind of sells that feeling of the forbidden.
It really does.
Like a bunch of people have come into this space, this temple, killed all the things that live there, a bunch of lizard men, and now they're in the process of pulling the jewels out of the idol's eyes.
Which they're cursed.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to take a quick little detour here. Baseline. If you enter a lair and you kill all the creatures and you see an idol and the idol has jewels in its eyes, it's cursed.
Yeah, like that thing's probably coming to life, right?
Easily.
Yeah. It's all super dark and serious and not really heroic.
And that's something I find very interesting because as an adventurer in D&D, more often than not, even if your alignment is a little sketchy, you are ultimately a hero. You're adventuring.
Yeah.
The basis of being an adventurer is being a hero. And what these dudes are doing isn't very heroic, isn't very nice either.
There's something about it that I think is an interesting choice in terms of putting it on the cover of the Player's Handbook. It's the back part of the cover where there's a bunch of guys hauling boxes and dragging corpses. It's like the aftermath of the fight. That you kind of, as the dungeon master, you kind of don't want to get into that stuff because it's dark.
It's really dark.
They're obviously like sealing up the room so like they don't have to worry about anything sneaking by or whatever, but it's just, corpse removal isn't something that a lot of D&D games focus on.
See, my idea brain for that is the guy who is standing there, who is overseeing the removal of the corpse. And even the guys who are wearing the armor, they don't really look like the guys who are sacking the place. So I'd imagine that is the king of the land people being like, all right, I can't believe you guys lived, so let's cheese it.
Oh, interesting. All right.
We were expecting just to kind of go in after you guys and pick up what's left, but since you're still here, move these boxes.
Yeah, that's a cool idea. And then there's the guy on the front cover who's cleaning his sword in front of like a pile of bodies on the altar. It's an odd choice.
It is very gritty compared to the Sutherland Bible coloring book style cover of the Monster Manual.
Yeah.
It's a very, very different kind of party.
I can understand why my parents saw this and were just like, maybe not. Maybe you need a couple more years.
Yeah.
This cover really contributed to a certain forbidden quality that I mentioned that has a lot in common with heavy metal album covers, cult books, and like all the stuff that was on the shelf behind the counter of the local bookshop,
It's funny because, you're watching TV shows from back in the 80s or even movies, and you see like the Burnout, he's the bad boy, he's got the denim jacket with the sleeves cut off, he's got like a Judas Priest poster on the wall, and like you see like a Player's Handbook like lying around, you're like, why does he have like a Dungeons & Dragons book? He's a bad boy. Well, let me tell you, D&D is for bad boys.
Yeah.
Or at least so parents thought.
Yeah. Man, I would kind of kill for a felt blacklight poster of this cover.
Stu, stop trying to get me to spend my money. It exists somewhere.
Yeah, some bootleg, unfortunately. Do you know anybody who does velvet paintings?
Stu, if I knew anyone who did velvet paintings, my entire apartment would be covered in them. Move along.
I'm just throwing it out there. Maybe we could work something out with wizards.
Fingers crossed, right?
So the Player's Handbook is the second book of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It came out the year after the Monster Manual, and it's everything you need to run characters in Dungeons and Dragons. I think out of the 3 books, it's sort of the most used. I think that the DM's guide is really just for one person to read every once in a while, whereas, you're constantly using the Player's Handbook. And I think that it also has the most iconic art throughout. It's split pretty evenly between Sutherland and Trampier, and it does a lot to sort of define what people thought D&D was at that time.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I also agree with the amount of use that it actually gets, because let's face it, when you are sitting there at a table with your players, if they're not on D&D Beyond on their phones looking up spells, they got that Player's Handbook right in front of them.
Yep,
and they're open and it's ready to go. Sometimes they got little index cards tabbed to the pages that the spells are on. Or even they're kind of like looking ahead, trying to find ways to exploit their character's class to see, it's like, well, does dodge really mean I can do this? And just trying to find ways to kind of pull one over on the Dungeon Master.
Reading those spell descriptions real close, seeing how you can lawyer that language.
Ooh, yeah. Whereas like with the DMG, it becomes a quick reference of, I wonder what that means when they found the way to lawyer that spell. Now I have to pull out my book as a dungeon master and figure out a way if this works.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't feel like it should, but I can't prove it.
And that sort of sets up the adversarial relationship that I think that early Dungeons and Dragons had between the players and the dungeon master. It's not arbitration, it's judgment. The DM is very much saying, you made your argument, I've looked at my book, and I am pronouncing judgment over what is happening.
That is an amazing way to look at it.
And I think that's definitely changed. I think that there's more of like a collaborative effort in role-playing games. It's not as antagonistic.
Well, look at it like this. Dungeons and Dragons has often been referred to as a power fantasy for the players, right? Back in the day, and even I would dare say I've played with dungeon masters as recent as like 10 years ago, where as a dungeon master, it's your own version of a power fantasy. Like for the players, it's a power fantasy. I can do all this cool stuff like pull-ups and like, not get winded running away from things and attacking things. And I'm not saying that in any way to shame anybody for their physical ability. I'm just saying that I can't do pull-ups and I can't run from stuff. Like I only run from the police into the ice cream man. And sometimes
When have you run from the police?
Allegedly. But I've definitely run to the ice cream man, and I've gotten winded. And also, I've been to Ren Fair, and I've tried swinging a sword, and that is hard.
Yeah, swords are heavy.
All this D&D fantasy stuff is much harder to do in real life. Like, for instance, I did a rugged maniac once. And as I'm slugging through the mud, I'm like, oh my God, so this is what difficult terrain is supposed to feel like. It was terrible. And that being said, it is a fantasy that you can do all this crazy cool stuff. Like, you're casting spells, you're doing the thing. Whereas, for the Dungeon Master, if it's an adversarial Dungeon Master, it's also a kind of power fantasy because you're like, I'm going to create this kill box. I'm going to try to kill my players. I'm going to make it excruciatingly difficult for them to do literally any of the cool stuff that they actually want to do. And that was kind of how it was, I'd imagine, back in the day, because the way these books are written, you are kind of really trying to kill your players.
Yeah, it's like an endless test of the player's cleverness to get through stuff. And I appreciate that. I do like to kill players when I'm running a game.
Yeah, you do.
I do, but that's not like my goal. Like that's my treat. Like, oh, I killed you, Hambo. Yay. But I also want you guys to get through it because I have a story I want to tell and I want you guys to see things, experience things, and have fun. It was definitely different back then. It was definitely a lot more unforgiving. Even the preface for the book is sort of a power grab by Gygax, where he's like, there needs to be a uniformity amongst different Dungeons & Dragons games. So that's why we're doing Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. It's so that there's a baseline, so everybody's sort of doing the same thing, that there's like benchmarks for how these things work. And I think that's interesting. We've talked a lot recently in these podcasts about the Wild West nature. This is sort of a way for Gygax to kind of...
He's cleaning up this one-horse town.
Yeah, he's like, this is my game, and this is how you're going to play it. It's a very authoritative tone.
Interesting.
Which I don't think really exists anymore. It's, play how you want to play.
Exactly.
That's very much where we're at.
And that being said, we could not get to the play how you want to play era without first having the this is how we do it.
Sure, yeah. You got to remember, too, that there were all sorts of different strains of how to play. It came out of the wargaming scene, so some people favored kind of these large-scale miniature combat things, and that lost the narrative or the cleverness or the exploration facets of the game. It does definitely benefit long-term from this sort of like work of rules and just standardizing things. But I don't like it when people tell me what to do.
Right.
And like, I don't think I've ever read the preface before today, but I don't know if it would have sat well with me.
And there you go.
You know, just like, oh, don't tell me how to run my game.
Yeah. I mean, you're a lot more forgiving when you're younger because you're just really trying to jump to the thing that actually catches your attention.
Yeah.
Hitting me with the rules up front is definitely a surefire way to get me to like, and the shades are going down.
Yeah.
And we're going to look at our phone and not really engage in this.
To that point, there's a lot of really great art in this book. There's the Sutherland illustration of a paladin in hell, which is just so like, what is the story here? And so many people were so interested in this. I feel like this should have been a Dio album.
I want it as a back patch for my denim jacket.
And so many people were interested in this that Mont Cook wrote an adventure based on it to tell us the story, to explain what happened here. And it's great. It took 20 years. It was a late 90s module that came out for second edition. And it just shows the longevity of this one illustration, you know?
Oh, yeah. I'm just waiting for them to make it as a Death Saves t-shirt. It's such an amazing piece, though. And it's one that I think when D&D artwork gets talked about, that is one that doesn't get talked about enough.
Another one is the magic mouth, which is like the creepiest. Like, why is there a mouth in the wall? Why is it talking? It always kind of reminded me a little bit of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy covers, like the little green guy.
Yep.
He was just all mouth. There's something weird about it, but interesting. And you have the idea of what magic is from fairy tales and stuff. But magic mouth was always like a really odd spell for me because you're actually making a mouth that speaks and delivers a message. Like, it's just an odd thing to me.
Well, at this point, your idea of magic is only what you've seen and heard from fairy tales, or like visually, you've got Witch Hazel from the Warner Brother cartoons, you've got Samantha from Bewitched, and you got the Wicked Witch of the West.
Yeah.
Like, that's what magic looks
You
like.
wave a wand and something happens.
Bibbidi bobbidi boo.
Yeah, there's no system behind it,
Yeah,
right?
Mickey and Fantasia.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas this, I would be horrified if I walked into a dungeon and the idea of like a wall looking at me and talking to me, like, and it looks gross too. You know I don't like gross things. It looks gross. I mean, I can't stop looking at it, but man, it's gross.
Why those dudes aren't hitting it with their swords, I don't know.
They're probably too busy peeing the pants. You know why adventurers never wear khakis? Exactly that reason.
Oh boy. Smelly.
Yeah.
And it also introduces the D&D multiverse, the Great Wheel concept. It's the first version of it. You know, it's pretty unrefined. It contains a lot of odd names like the Happy Hunting Grounds, and it's all very rooted in traditional folklore of the real world, which they very emphatically tried to get away from as things developed. This is the first time it's in print, and so much comes out of this and is like locked in my brain. Like, I just love the Great Wheel. It's probably my favorite thing that Gary Gygax ever came up with.
It's the multiverse.
Yeah.
Before there was even like the word the multiverse.
Yeah, and it's just like this idea that these planes exist, that magic comes from it, that gods live there, that it's like the afterlife, but also a place to visit.
That there's a cost for magic.
Yeah, like all of this stuff. It's a couple brief pages in the back of the book, the known planes of existence. And it's a great illustration, too. The levels are all trailing off, and it's just great.
When I was younger in high school, they had us reading like different things, and they showed us like Dante's Inferno and like the 7 levels of hell.
Yeah.
And then I opened the book up later in life when I first got my Players Handbook, and I'm like, oh my God, this actually makes so much more sense.
Yeah, it's so great. It's just a foundational book. There's no getting away from it. This book warped so many minds.
In all the right ways.
Yep.
So, Stu, do you have any final thoughts on the Player's Handbook for this mini-sode?
No.
Well, before...
I'm done. Let's go home.
That's why it's a mini episode. So first, before we sign off, I want to shout out to Jeff Griswold, who was the original owner of My Player's Handbook. Oh. He's got his name written in pencil on the inside, his phone number as well, which I'm sure is no longer in service.
Mine has a name in it too. It's Edward Goldman III, which is funny because we have a friend named Ed Coleman.
Oh,
so close. So close.
So close.
And I have his full address in Metairie, Louisiana. If you want it back, Ed Goldman, just give me $15.
Stu, you're selling the kid back his own book.
Well, I bought it for $15.
That's fair. And you know what? He gave it away in the first place. But Ed Goldman, for real, if it's meant to happen, it'll come back to you.
Yeah.
for $15.
I mean, he got rid of it. How a book from Metairie, Louisiana wound up in New Jersey, I will never know.
It's the glory of the used bookstore. In fact, mine came from Half Price Books.
Nice.
And I actually bought mine when I was out on tour with a band in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
All right.
So, D&D books, they get around.
Yeah. Mine came from Montclair Book Center.
And all the best Beach Boys, wholesome sense. So this was another awesome episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can people find you?
Every day on Instagram at Vintage RPG, posted about role-playing games that are vintage.
It's kind of our thing. You can find me on Twitter at Hambreaker. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons and Dragons, and I tweet about professional wrestling. You can also find me on Instagram for my day-to-day podcasting and life adventures at John Hambone McGuire. And you can check out my other podcast, My Tai Happy Hour. It's pop culture for weirdos wherever podcasts are found. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.